So, how often do you think of the Roman Empire? Once a month? Once a week? Every day? If you're a man, so the viral trend tells us, the answer is maybe quite a lot. Although what quite a lot means is debatable, but I guess if you're subscribed to this channel, your answer is for at least half an hour a week. I missed this whole trend because I'm not on social media, and so I caught up retrospectively. So for anyone else who might not know, this is a thing that started a year or so ago when women on social media, especially on TikTok and Instagram, began filming themselves, asking the men in their lives, "How often do you think of the Roman Empire?" And women all around the world were then shocked to discover the response, which revealed that many modern men are in fact preoccupied with ancient Rome, or at least that's what the flabbergasted female responses would make you think. Honestly, I think it was a bit silly how amazed and shocked some of these women were acting, laughing and asking incredulously, "But why? I never think about Rome," and all of that. But obviously, I'm an outlier because I think about ancient Rome for at least 8 hours a day, every day, and often a lot more, and I'm female. But given the legacy of Rome, at least in the Western world, it seems mad to me that it would never cross the transoms of your mind. Anyway, all of that notwithstanding, the unexpectedness of these responses led to more viral videos which amassed squillions of views and started a widespread discussion, which was actually interesting, about why men think so much about Rome. Some of this was about gender differences in historical interests or just interests generally. And some commentators suggested that men's fascination with the Roman Empire relates to themes such as power, engineering, and military strategy. And I had a big argument with my colleague who I used to share an office with in Oxford because he tried to tell me that everyone comes to Roman history initially because they're inspired by the big battles and the bravery and the war heroes. And I told him that we aren't in Victorian England anymore and that there's so much else of interest in Roman history and Roman culture, and I argued that that simply wasn't true. But having seen this trend now, maybe, just maybe, he had a point. So in this episode, we'll meet a goddess who I think holds the key to why many men, people really, but men in particular, think so much about the Roman Empire. So this is my take on it. Forgive me, I'm female. But then again, the answer I'm offering to this masculine quandary is also a goddess. So let's see. I welcome all discussion and disagreement and would love to hear whether by the end of this episode I've at all convinced you that this goddess really does underpin so much of how we think about and feel about ancient Rome. Her name is Virtus, and she's the third in our trilogy of goddesses related to war and religion in ancient Rome. We've looked at Victoria, who represented victory and embodied the spirit of Rome's eternal triumph. And we've looked at Bellona, a bloodthirsty incarnation of war and the chaos of the battlefield. And this third goddess is connected to both. In some ways, she triangulates the conceptual landscape of war, balancing out the victory won by the banshee kind of berserking represented by Bellona with valor, glory, discipline, and virtue. So once more, to arms, and let us enter the realm of Virtus. Faced with the prospect of going abroad and waging war against Rome's great enemy Carthage, the young, still beardless, still untested Scipio ponders his future. He rests under a laurel tree in the shade as his destiny remains unclear. The poet Silius Italicus, writing in the 1st century CE, knows well, as did his audience, and indeed everyone ever since who remembers the Punic Wars, that Rome will prevail and Scipio will be its champion. Scipio Africanus, forever remembered as one of Rome's greatest heroes, But in this pensive, half-awake moment in the shade of the laurels, the future and destiny is yet unknown. As Scipio turns over in his mind whether or not going to war is a good idea, the poet tells us that two figures, exceeding mortal stature, descended from the sky to left and right. He says, here stood Virtus, and there Voluptus, pleasure, her foe. Silius Italicus describes Voluptus as oozing with decadence. She wafts a trail of Persian perfumes from her loose and long-flowing hair. She is draped in the finest, most expensive purples, all embroidered with gold, and she has wanton, wandering eyes all aflame. She's the first to speak, confident of her promise. Voluptus entreats Scipio. She says, "Why this unbecoming foolishness, my boy, wasting the flower of your youth in fighting? Surely you recall Cannae, the river Po, and Trasimene, that Lydian lake more dreadful than the Stygian marsh?" These were all terrible defeats that shook Rome to the very core. How long will you defy fate on the battlefield? Now would you aim at Spain, the realm of Atlas, and the walls of Carthage herself? I advise that you desist from seeking danger, risking your life in the heat of battle. Unless you shun her worship, virtue will have you racing wildly into the ranks of death, the heart of every fire. And then the poet tells us a lot about Virtus through the mouth of her voluptuous enemy. So it was. Who sent your father and your uncle down to the dark waters of Erebus? In other words, she sent them to their deaths. They died in battle. And threw away the life of Paulus, as in days gone by she wasted the lives of the Decii. These were all war heroes who died in battle. She it is who holds out the shade, no longer aware of his deeds on earth, the emptiness of some glorious epitaph to adorn the tomb that holds his ashes. In other words, Voluptus is casting death and battle in very bleak terms, pointing to a massive waste of life and youth and the ultimate worthlessness of praise if you are dead. And so she makes her own case. Yet, follow me, my boy, and the terms of life granted you will be free from hardship. Nor will the war trumpet trouble your anxious sleep. Nor will you feel the Arctic blast, nor the fierce heat of cancer, nor snatch a bite to eat on a blood-stained field. The pangs of thirst will be absent, the helm filled with dust, all the host of fearful tasks. For you will spend happy days and unclouded hours, and a life of ease will grant you the expectation of a ripe old age. How many things the gods themselves have created for our enjoyment! How many delights they offer with generous hand! Do the gods not set an example of peaceful existence to mortals, imperturbably calm, their minds at rest? And she goes on, mortal years rush by, no man lives twice, passes the hour, the torrent of death snatches you away. You can bear naught that pleased you to the shades. What man, as the last of the light is fading from his eyes, does not sigh too late for the days of pleasure? So Voluptus makes a case for the easy life of delights and comfort and making hay while the sun shines, and it's a pretty compelling and seductive case. Her foe, Virtus, however, now takes her turn to speak. The poet describes her as the polar opposite of the soft and alluring pleasure. She is calm in face and aspect, with a steady gaze and a pleasant modesty. Her hair is free but not coiffured and perfumed, and she is draped simply in a white robe. She speaks directly to Voluptus and accuses her. How can you tempt a lad in the flower of his age to a life of shadowy illusions? He whom the gods have granted the gift of reason and the divine seed of mighty intellect. As mortal creatures are to the gods above, so are all other creatures to man, for nature herself assigned such lesser gods to earth. Yet a fixed law condemns degenerate spirits to dwell in dark Avernus, while the gates of the heavens stand open to those nourishing the divine seed within them. In other words, Virtus says that all the things that Voluptus has promised are what leads to a dark and dismal life in the underworld. Virtus claims that the heavens themselves are open to those who are divinely inspired. She goes on through a list of mythological mortals who have, through their bravery, become gods in death. And then she says, "Do you not see how a god raised the human face towards the heavens, giving mortals an upward gaze, yet made the flocks and herds, the various species of birds and wild beasts, to go on their bellies, sluggish of mind and crude of nature? For the human species is born for glory, and man is happy in seeking glory if he accepts the gifts of heaven." She goes on to talk about Rome's humble beginnings and then exclaims, "But see how high she has climbed by her own valor." And then she goes on to describe how Voluptus, by contrast, is a corrupting, ruinous force that has brought down great cities. "And see how a host of cities that once flourished were ruined by excess. For neither the god's wrath nor an enemy's spears are as fatal as when pleasure infects the mind. Her attendants are foul, drunkenness, and debauchery. Scandal hovers about her on dark wings." All these are degenerate qualities that Roman society frowned upon, which Virtus then contrasts with her own virtuous and admirable attendants. She lists them. "Mine are honor, praise and fame, glory with her smiling face, and Victoria raising snow-white wings like mine, while triumph, laurel-crowned, lifts me to the stars." So here you see the relationship of Virtus to the world of war that we've been exploring and the positive spin Rome put on battles and endless wars. Here you see Victoria, as we encountered her a couple of episodes ago, winged in glory and triumphant, placing her laurels on the victor's head. And now you also see the relationship of Virtus to Victoria, that is, the connection of that manly, martial kind of valor and virtue to the glory of success and victory. However, unlike the path of pleasure, these are not easy gains. Virtus stresses how these accolades are hard won. She continues, "My house is pure and stands on a lofty hill. A steep track leads there by a rocky ascent. So hard is the effort you must undergo. It is never my custom to deceive, and you must truly exert yourself to enter, and not consider good what fickle fortune can give and also take away. Soon you will gain the heights and gaze down on humankind below. You will ever encounter the opposite of pleasure's persuasions. On a bed of straw beneath the stars, you will suffer sleepless nights, mastering cold and hunger. You shall worship justice in all you do. The gods will stand witness and judge your actions. And then, whenever your country in dire events demands, you must be the first to arm, first to enter the breach in the enemy wall, and neither steel nor gold must command your thoughts. I will give you no robes dyed with Tyrian purple, no fragrant perfumes that demean a man, but the gift of overcoming by force that savage foe that harasses the armies of Rome, and after the Carthaginian defeat, of placing your proud laurels there in the lap of Capitoline Jove." So Virtus offers a difficult road to hard-won but long-lived and exalted success. She offers Scipio no pleasure except the pleasures of victory and glory, and that ultimate pleasure of laying his victorious laurel wreath in the lap of Jupiter, signifying his victory for Rome and its gods. Scipio, like the exemplary Roman the audience knew him to be, was persuaded by Virtus, and the rest, as they say, is history. The dialogue between Virtus and Voluptus marvelously encapsulates the spirit of Virtus from the Roman perspective. I have to confess, for my own part, I would have been quite persuaded by Voluptus's promises of Persian perfumes and Tyrian purples, but then again, I am female after all, and Virtus is supposed to appeal fundamentally to men and manliness, and she operates very much in a masculine domain. There's something odd, of course, about having the divinity of masculine excellence represented by a female goddess, and we'll think more about that in a moment. But the point is that in Silius Italicus's poem, the choice Scipio had to make was, for a Roman man, self-evident. The hunger, blood, trials and tribulations of a soldier on campaign that Voluptus paints in these dismal terms as a total waste of time and youth are, through the frame of Virtus, the very path to the honour and glory to which Roman youths were supposed to aspire. Through the words of Virtus, we see many of the values of Roman society at work, especially the virtuousness of martial prowess. So I think you can see why I've picked out Virtus as the third in our trilogy of goddesses to illuminate Rome's religious landscapes in the territory of war. In the early days, Virtus was quite explicitly a virtue gained at war and on the battlefield. You had to be tested to win this kind of honour, and so Virtus played an important part in valorizing Rome's project of war and expansion. The empire was understood fundamentally to have been built on the back of and by the virtues of its men. Cicero put Rome's success in building its empire down to Virtus, the courage and excellence of its soldiers and their ability to face death with honour rather than disgrace was what he saw as the essential force behind the victories over foreign enemies. Here's part of a speech he delivered in his Philippics talking about Virtus, in the lower case, as a virtue, not the goddess who presided over it. Virtus is what typically drives off the cruelty of death and shame that comes with it. Virtus, which is the special mark of the Roman race and lineage. Hold on to this, I beg you, men of Rome, this virtue that your ancestors handed down to you as an inheritance. All other things are false, uncertain, fleeting, and unstable. Virtus alone is planted with the deepest roots, so firmly that it can never be shaken by any force, never moved from its place. It was through this Virtus that your ancestors first conquered the whole of Italy, then destroyed Carthage, overthrew Numantia, and brought the most powerful kings and the most warlike peoples under the sway of this empire. The qualities of Virtus were thus the qualities of everything that was perceived to be good about men. And so far as Romans were concerned, they triumphed and were victorious not just because they were good men, but because they were the best men. So this is going to annoy everyone in the modern age of gender bendiness and fluidity, and fair enough. But by the same token, it's going to be a welcome antidote to the absolutely awful and corroding concept of toxic masculinity. Virtus is basically the opposite. She's a goddess of wholesome masculinity, in the context of Roman society at least. Virtus was always rooted in the battlefield, but especially as time went on, she extended far beyond it. Once upon a time, it would have been possible to have had virtus due to your fighting prowess alone, even if your conduct in everyday life was questionable. But this changed. It became more, a way of conduct and life in general, a set of values that embodied manly glory, dignity, nobility and humility, strength and restraint. Over time, then, it had an increasingly moral and ethical side to it. And of course, once Christianity got its hands on it, virtue, in the sense that we understand it today, is something quite different to its original meaning. On occasion, it was applied to women who had acted bravely in a particularly masculine fashion, but fundamentally, the word always belonged to the masculine sphere. Etymologically, virtus comes from the Latin for man, vir. And that's a Latin V, by the way. It changed over time, but it's often written with a U and sounds more like a W for much of the time. But it would be okay also just to say virtus if you're more comfortable with that. And virtus, lowercase, basically denotes the ideal behavior of a man, and virtus, uppercase, is the divinized force behind that behavior. So why on earth would a deity behind something so very male and so very masculine be a goddess rather than a god? Well, this part will appeal to the gender-bendy side of things. Basically, it comes down to grammar. Latin is a gendered language, which means that all nouns have a gender, either masculine, feminine, or neuter. And this is true whether you're talking about doors, tables, cats, porridge, or virtue. And it happens that virtus ends up being grammatically feminine. So as a concept, it was always feminine, even though what it described was consummately masculine. Now, virtus, like so many of the deities we've discussed so far, comes out of the mists of history in a human form. But she had once, I think, been something nebulous, a numinous force without form. Around the same time as many of the other deities, such as Bellona last week, virtus was anthropomorphized. She takes on a human body. And given that virtus was always spoken of grammatically in the feminine, it makes sense that she would manifest then as a goddess. I don't think it's really so strange. Like sailors praying to Mary, or indeed to Mata Matuta for deliverance, the goddess can inspire men, benignly endow them with the virtues they seek, and act as a guiding light for them through the storm. That's my own take, and that's what we see in the poem we looked at about Scipio, with Voluptus and virtus enticing the young general down two very different paths. Certainly we don't find anyone in the ancient world finding it particularly strange. But what precipitated her human form to step out of the aniconic, animistic mists of early Roman religion? Well, like Bellona, a temple was vowed to her in battle, or at least during a war, when the general Marcus Claudius Marcellus marches onto the pages of history. This man's track record reads like a Roman fantasy. Pliny tells us he fought in 39 battles in his lifetime. He was consul 5 times, he twice held the praetorship, was twice awarded a proconsulship, he'd conquered Gauls, routed Hannibal, celebrated 2 triumphs, sacked Syracuse, and decorated Rome with its riches. And most significantly of all, he had won and dedicated the legendary Spolia Opima. The Spolia Opima was the most honourable war trophy a Roman general could hope to win, and it was almost never won except in legend. In fact, this was the 3rd and final time it would ever happen, and the other previous 2 times were legends and may never have happened. The trophy consisted of the armour and weapons and everything stripped from the man commanding the enemy forces after he'd been killed. But the flinch was that he had to be killed in hand-to-hand combat between the 2 opposing leaders. The Spolia Opima was a big deal in Rome, and that Marcus Claudius Marcellus had won it made him a larger-than-life sort of hero. So this is the man who twice vowed a temple to Onus and Virtus. He made his vow in the battle that won him the superlative victory of the Spolia Opima in 222 BCE, when he himself slew the Gallic king Viridomarus at the Battle of Clastidium. He vowed the temple again 10 years later in another battle in 212 BCE because there were some delays for a bunch of technical reasons and the temple still hadn't been built. But the main thing is that eventually it was built. And you'll notice that it was to two deities, namely Onus and Virtus. Onus was a divinization of honor in the sense of political standing. Mostly he was a god of magistracies and the kind of esteem that came through holding political office, combined with Virtus, the goddess of manly virtue and martial glory, they made a good complementary pair. The idea was that political office and power came through having proven yourself a good general who was successful on the battlefield. This will be immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with Roman politics, especially the politics of the Roman Republic. The way to office and power came through the respect gained from military success. It was no secret. Cicero put it plainly like this: "Who can doubt that military experience brings far more prestige towards gaining the consulship than glory in civil law?" So then Virtus was the path to Onus. Ideologically, they went hand in hand. And so the temple that was built for the pair ended up reflecting this relationship. And there were two separate cult centers, a cella for each deity. The cella was the room that housed the cult statue. But you had to walk through the cult center for Virtus first to get to that of Onus. In other words, you needed martial glory to achieve political success. That in no way subordinated Virtus to Onus, though. They were different fields of glory. Virtus was very powerful in her own right, and in the end she outdid Onus. Alas, nothing remains of the temple, but the sources tell us it was situated at the Porta Capena. This was one of the main gates to the city if you were coming up from the south along the Via Appia. That's the Appian Way. So the location was a prominent one, advertising Onus and Virtus to everybody passing in and out of Rome. There were other temples and shrines erected solely to Virtus over time. For a good while, though, this pair of gods regularly appeared together, especially on coins, and coins are our best testament to their appearance. If you look at the pair, you might mix them up. Onus is the one with the bear head, and he has a laurel wreath on his head and civilian clothes. He sometimes carries a cornucopia, signifying abundance. Virtus, however, looks quite distinctive. Not only is she a female and warlike, but she's depicted as a very foreign type of female warrior. She is, in fact, an Amazon. This brave tribe of warrior women were mythical mostly, although loosely based, it seems, on some rumours of warrior women on the Scythian steppes or in the high Caucasus mountains. So the deity of Roman manly virtue was not only a goddess, but a barbarian goddess. And barbarians for the Greeks and Romans were people who came from the hinterlands, beyond the pale of what they considered the civilized world. And the Amazons were barbaric in that sense. They were wild, very other in their culture and their behavior. Certainly their behavior was nothing like the decorum of the ideal Roman woman. They shunned men, and they fought like men. And so they were terrifying and exciting simultaneously. It seems that when Marcus Claudius Marcellus had to put Virtus into human female form, this one made sense. So you'll recognize Virtus from her Amazonian presence in Roman art. She wears a helmet and a short tunic that's above the knees that often reveals strong horse-riding thighs. She holds a spear and a knife and wears lion pelt boots. In fact, this was such a powerful image. It's also how Roma, the personified goddess of Rome itself, came to be depicted. But you'll be able to tell them apart because Roma does have the decorum of a Roman matron about her, whereas Virtus maintains the warrior spirit of the battlefield, and always has one breast exposed. Virtus was so synonymous with the spirit of Rome that she became a very popular theme in the iconography of Roman emperors. The emperor needed to justify his position as a deserved one, and so advertising his virtus theoretically made him seem like he had earned the role. We therefore see virtus appear on a great many coins of the imperial age. For the same reason, however, onos fades away. Onos encouraged political competition, and he represented the vying for power so characteristic of the Senate during the Republic. Under the imperial system, however, all of that was stripped away from the Senate. Competition for power was on the one hand an intolerable threat to the emperor, if somebody else were vying for his position. But on the other hand, since the emperor himself possessed all the power, the imperium, the uncontested power all to himself, the kind of competitive honor that onos represented had become obsolete. And there is a muted sense of that loss of him that comes through in some of our sources. But Virtus carries on strong, firing spirits until the empire itself toppled and fell. So to get back to the question with which we started, if virtus embodies the traits traditionally valorized in male socialization, courage, strength, stoicism, discipline, and honor through action, especially in war or in public duty, then I think it's easy to see her as the main reason why men think so much about the Roman Empire. But I think perhaps more than ever for men today, where those ideals of masculinity are in flux or challenged or even criticized, the Roman Empire becomes appealing because it seems to offer a kind of psychological sandbox where those lost or contested values are still clear-cut and exalted. The Roman Empire is full of hyper-masculine figures, Scipio, Marius, Crassus, Pompey, Sertorius, Caesar, who all modelled virtus in action. So to think about Rome is to mentally revisit a world where men's roles were unapologetically heroic, decisive, unambiguous, and masculine. There's a simplicity to that moral universe which may be appealing amid today's complexity, but I also think it's just appealing in general, at least in theory as some kind of fantasy. People, male and female, love films like Gladiator for exactly these kinds of values. And it was those sorts of values that Roman society loved too. Romans told stories about their real heroes the same way we watch movies about them. And we are entertained. And somewhere beneath our titillation, maybe the Roman Empire becomes a kind of nostalgic mythology, not for empire per se, but for a framework of masculinity that feels stable, admired, and celebrated. So I don't think men are thinking about Rome because they have a secret desire to conquer Gaul. It seems to me, and go ahead and disagree in the comments if you like, whether gym bros or rugby lads or solitary stoic types with their head down just weathering the storm, that many males today think about Rome because they perceive virtus there. And what virtus taps into is something that seems to appeal to a lot of men, a deep archetype of the tested self, the man who goes into the world and becomes worthy through rites of passage, through struggle and bravery, self-realization and recognition. This is what we saw Virtus explain to Scipio in the poem I read for you. What she offers is the tough road through discipline to an earned respect and honor. And perhaps in a world where voluptas is ever more persuasive and winning out, since whatever vices might beguile you are only ever as far away as your phone, then Virtus begins to sound a lot like the gurus on modern podcasts, recommending that you do the hard thing and look to the inward-facing virtues of self-control and perseverance, and ultimately to self-worth and dignity. And just as they strove for it, something worth noting about Virtus in the Roman psyche is that they also feared losing it. They feared losing it on an individual level, but also at a larger community level. Just as Virtus warned Scipio, the decadence and degeneracy of voluptas can cause the ruination not just of individuals, but of great cities and entire communities. So there's poignancy in the end, I think, on multiple levels, to read the account of a Byzantine historian recording the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 CE. Defeated, Rome, impoverished, had to pay her ransom to her conqueror. We are told even the statues of the gods were toppled and melted down to meet the demands of the Goths. The historian Zosimus writes, "From every side things were rushing towards the ruin of the city. They did not merely strip the cult statues of their adornment, but even melted down some of those made of gold and silver, among which was also the statue of manly excellence, which the Romans called Virtus. And when this was destroyed, all that remained of courage and Virtus among the Romans was also extinguished." So there it is, conquered by the Goths on that gloomy day when Virtus was toppled and physically melted down. Rome's masculine valour, glory and moral backbone also melted away and was understood to have died with her. And so, I would argue, we've been thinking about the Roman Empire, and by extension Virtus, ever since.